we're having a little mic trouble. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. If I could just intrude on your table discussions for a moment to introduce myself and give you a little information about the program, and then I will encourage you to get back to your lunches. My name is Diana Newton. I am a senior fellow at the Tower Center for Political Studies here at SMU. And I also teach as an adjunct professor and teach national security policy and policymaking. And on behalf of the Tower Center and SMU, I would just like to welcome you and thank you for taking time out of your busy day to be with us here for what will be a very interesting and turns out to be a very timely discussion, given that King Salman was at the White House on Friday with President Obama. So we're really lucky to have Ambassador Bob Jordan here to talk about his book. Before I get started, I'd like to take a moment to recognize our Tower Center board members and friends of the center. Our guest of honor is actually the Tower Center vice chairman of the board, Bob Jordan. He's also a diplomat in residence, a professor of the practice, and an esteemed colleague at the center. Jean Tower Cox and Jack Vaughn are board members as well. Liz Armstrong is chair of the executive board of Dedman College, and we're really glad that she came today. Lynn Novak and Hiroki Takeuchi are senior fellows of mine at the Tower Center. And we also have Lai Liang here, and she's an associate research fellow in the Tower Center. So we're all here excited to hear from Ambassador Jordan. And we're just delighted to be hosting a talk given by one of our own colleagues about his recently published memoir on assuming the position of U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia in the wake of the 9/11 terror attacks. I will just say I thought his memoir was incredibly well written and riveting. It was a quick and fun read, and I encourage you all to look into it. It was really entertaining. And our program today happens to coincide with the posting of a significant interview that Ambassador Jordan did with Lai Liang, who is a professor of Middle East policy at SMU and, as I said, an associate research fellow at the Tower Center. She did this interview as part of the Collective Memory Project, which is run by the Center for Presidential History here at SMU, and they have posted this interview under the section Leaders at Home and Abroad on the website for the Center for Presidential History. So I highly recommend that to you as well, where he not only talks about some of the stories that are in the book, but others that didn't make it into the book. And it's a really interesting and in-depth interview about the ambassador's time in Saudi Arabia. So now I would like to invite you to get back to your lunch. And once we get to sort of the dessert part of the meal, I will come back to the podium to introduce Ambassador Jordan. He will make remarks, and then we will open it up to your questions. And at the end of the program, we will have a book signing outside the hall, if you're interested. Okay? So enjoy your lunch. Thank you. Hello again. I'm ready. Thought it might be a good idea for us to get ready to kick off our program for this afternoon. And so I would encourage you to please keep eating. If you haven't finished your lunch, please definitely keep eating your dessert and enjoying your coffee. We don't want to interrupt your meal, but want to save as much time as we can to hear from Ambassador Jordan and for Q&A with all of you. And I have to say, it is a really special treat for me to be the moderator of the program today, because Ambassador Jordan is a longtime friend to both my husband and myself. My husband, Jeff, works at Baker Botts. And I have no actual data to support my hunch, but I believe we may be the only couple in Dallas who have shared Ambassador Jordan as a colleague at work. My husband worked with him for 27 years at Baker Botts, and I have been a colleague of his for the last few years here at the Tower Center. So it makes it a really special program for me today to be the moderator. I know you all have Bob's bio in front of you in the booklet that was on your chairs or at your place. And you can see that he has had a distinguished career as a lawyer and as a diplomat. But rather than restate all of the accomplishments he has gotten throughout his career, I just want to say that one of the key points that really jumped out to me in reviewing his bio and after reading the book is that he really, at the crux of it all, is a leader. And it's his leadership skills and his qualities as a leader that have distinguished him and made him so successful. And of course, he brings with his leadership substantive depth, but it's his ability to articulate his ideas and his opinions in ways that draw others to him. and that brings sides together, whether it's a legal dispute or a diplomatic dispute. And he really has had a long history in doing that. And I think we're very lucky to be able to hear from him today. His book, Desert Diplomat, Inside Saudi Arabia Following 9/11, is, I just can't recommend it highly enough. It is really entertaining. It is really insightful. It's a quick read infused with humor and insider scoop on life as the highest-ranking American serving inside the Saudi Arabian kingdom in the wake of 9/11. He offers great stories about the dysfunction of the U.S. government, great stories about the dysfunction of the Saudi Arabian government, and he shares stories about his greatest accomplishments and stories about his greatest frustrations. He even ends the book, or towards the end, he lists the 11 things he will miss about the job and the 10 things he will not miss about the job, and that was great too. He even lets the reader in on his nickname in the field, which was Badassador. So it's really a fun read. And what we're going to do is show a brief interview of Bob about the book. It's about 3 minutes long, as you can see. And then he will join, or he'll come to the podium and speak, and then we'll open it up to some discussion and questions. So let me...
When your friend, the President of the United States, asks you to serve your country, you really can't say no, can you? You know, Secretary James Baker has said that ambassadors are the Swiss Army knives of diplomacy. You have to be able to do everything. You're in charge of all of the assets of America abroad in your country. About 8:30, the plane had just hit one of the towers of the World Trade Center.
MSNBC has just flashed on my screen. It looks like there is a plane that's crashed into the World Trade Center.
Which made it pretty clear that we were under attack. I knew at that moment that my life had changed forever. I was going to have to work with our government to determine whether the Saudis really were friend or foe. Desert Diplomat is an easy read. It's designed for people who don't necessarily know much about the Middle East. It's a very intimate, personal account of my life there, what went on at one of the most important times in the history of the Middle East. When I arrived in Saudi Arabia, the relationship really was on life support, and it turned out that I was one of the people who needed to administer the CPR. It gave me a completely new appreciation for the difficulty that the citizens of these countries live in. May 12, 2003 is a night that I'll never forget. My phone rings. The Al Hamra compound, which housed a lot of American and Western citizens, had been bombed by terrorist bombings. 2 other compounds had just been hit as well. We developed a joint counterterrorism center where we were able to review intelligence real time, shoulder to shoulder with the Saudis, and I think that made a big difference. One of the things that I had not anticipated when I went into government was the degree to which there was friction within my own government and infighting and sharp elbows. Being in the Oval Office visiting President Bush, so they think Cheney and Rumsfeld are running the show. And it's the only time I've really seen President Bush visibly angry. And he whirled around and said, "You tell them I'm running the show." I engage, I think, in some pretty strict, tough criticism of my own administration. I made mistakes. We all made some terrible mistakes during that period. You actually can make a difference. You can come in, develop relationships, and develop programs. And with the right team behind you, you can actually make life better. You can improve relationships between countries. You can aim toward environment in which people can operate even though they have completely different values. This is, I think, a story that everyone can relate to, a rare glimpse at someone who had a front row seat to history.
It's also available right outside after that. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Robert Jordan to the podium.
Diana, thank you so much. with that desert sand blowing, I feel like this should be sort of a Siegfried and Roy act in Las Vegas coming out of the smoke, but pardon the over-dramatization. We had a lot of fun making that video. Can everyone hear me okay? It's a real treat to be here back home again at SMU, where I've enjoyed so much time with the students, with the faculty, with the supporters of SMU, and particularly the Tower Center. This is a real treat for me to be here and speak with you. I think it's also kind of a timely opportunity, as Diana said, in light of King Salman's visit with President Obama last Friday. To give you a little context, I will give you some background on the first presidential summit that I attended at Crawford in April of 2002. You can imagine after 9/11, the U.S.-Saudi relationship was, as we said in the video, fractured on life support. 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudis, and we really were wondering whether the Saudis were friend or foe. We started trying to get the Saudis to help us identify other suspects, terrorist cells, dangerous people, and so we would feed them names. During the fall of 2001, they would go out and round up some of the suspects, but they didn't much cooperate with us in finding out who they were or what they were about. They wouldn't share with us the results of the interrogations. They wouldn't share with us what was in what we call the pocket litter, the cell phones, the scraps of paper, the hard drives on their computers. And this became quite frustrating. But I also learned a harsh truth pretty early on, and that is that our own government didn't really have its act together in trying to address many of these issues in the Middle East as well. We had very few FBI agents who spoke Arabic. I mean, you could count them on one hand. We also had a relatively small number in the CIA. And the CIA and the FBI did not play nice together. This was a problem. I can recall going into the Minister of Interior and being asked by the CIA to find out why we hadn't received reams and reams of information that they had promised us about the suspects that we were giving them names of and we were having them round up. And the minister turned to me and he said, "Well, Ambassador, we gave that information to the FBI 2 months ago. They simply had not shared it with the CIA." And this stovepipe mentality is something that you hear about, but it's really hard to believe that after so much discussion and so much analysis, it still existed. And so on my next trip back to Washington, I met with George Tenet at the CIA, I met with Bob Mueller at the FBI, and told them of these problems. And they, of course, agreed, yes, it is a problem. No, we didn't order this. We certainly don't want our underlings doing this. We'll do something about it. But it took a really long time, I'm talking about almost a year or more, to get a unified approach to intelligence gathering, to law enforcement in the kingdom. We did make progress, and I think over time we were able to get the Saudis to join us in realizing that they had a real problem in their midst. But when I first arrived in Riyadh, I called on the governor of Riyadh, Prince Salman, who is now King Salman, the king of Saudi Arabia, and just tried to take his temperature about how he felt about the attacks of 9/11. And he said, "Well, you know, this couldn't have been 15 Saudi hijackers. The Saudis would never do this. This has to have been an Israeli plot. The Mossad did it." And I said to myself, what have I gotten into? Is this Alice in Wonderland, or where am I? I then went to the Minister of Interior, Prince Nayef, who later became Crown Prince. And he said the same thing. And so apparently they had gotten together and decided this was going to be their narrative until they could figure out something better to say. And it took them a while. But fortunately, I was also able to enlist the cooperation and ultimately the friendship of Prince Saud al-Faisal, the Saudi foreign minister who recently passed away. Prince Saud got it. He understood that they had a real extremism problem in the kingdom. He'd been educated at Princeton. He spoke better English than I did. And he was a true strong ally in our efforts to combat terrorism and eradicate al-Qaeda from Saudi Arabia. But he couldn't do it by himself. I couldn't do it by myself, and we had a lot of fits and starts. But we started working up to the notion of inviting Crown Prince Abdullah, who was really running the kingdom since King Fahd was incapacitated due to a stroke, inviting him to a summit meeting in the U.S. And finally, the president had Vice President Cheney come over and extend the invitation to come in mid-April of 2002 to Crawford. Well, after the invitation was extended, it was not immediately accepted. And the Crown Prince called me in one time and said, what's this Crawford thing? Why am I not invited to the White House? Is he really trying to belittle me? Is this some sort of half-hearted gesture? And I said, no, Your Royal Highness, it's quite the opposite. The President has only had one or two heads of state to his ranch, and the ranch is his home. This is a personal invitation because he wants a personal relationship with you, and it's a compliment of the highest order. Well, that apparently worked. And it happened to have the advantage of being true. And so they started making preparations to come to this summit. But this was at a time that you may recall when we were experiencing what was called the Second Intifada, the Palestinian uprising in the Palestinian territories against the Israelis. And there were atrocities committed, bombings at discos in Israel, and really terrible violence against Israelis and terrible reprisals against the Palestinians. And so we saw the world really in flames at this point. And I will tell you that when I would come back to the U.S., I would see pictures and descriptions of the violence against Israelis in our media. But in the Arab world, all you saw were pictures and descriptions of the violence against the Palestinians. You would see a dead Palestinian baby on the front page of the paper almost every day. And so Crown Prince Abdullah was being advised by his advisors to turn down this invitation at the last minute, kind of like King Salman did recently at Camp David. And he finally said, no, I'm going to go, and I'm going to bring a video to show President Bush about the carnage against the Palestinians in the Palestinian territories. And that's going to be my mission. I think it partly was a good political move on his part. This would allow him to convince his ultra-conservative supporters that he wasn't simply going to cave in and be a porch dog for the president. But the summit was shaping up to be a really nasty event. And unbeknownst to me, the Saudis had delivered to the White House a list of 8 demands that they wanted addressed at this summit meeting. And they were very serious demands. This was at a time when the Israelis were holding Yasser Arafat essentially isolated at his compound in Ramallah. There was a siege at the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, where Palestinians had broken into the church. And the entire region was really in terrible shape. So we went ahead with the summit. We decided to meet at an airstrip outside of Waco. It's a place called Texas Technical College, and they have a pretty large airstrip there that can accommodate 747s. I met Colin Powell there in the hangar, and we were waiting for Crown Prince Abdullah and the Saudi air fleet to arrive. And Powell turns to me and he says, you know, Bob, the Crown Prince doesn't like to fly in helicopters, and so we're not going to be taking a helicopter to the ranch. He has chartered a tour bus, essentially. And so we went out and looked at the bus, and this was a tour bus with gold filigree, captain's chairs, decals everywhere. It looked like Dolly Parton going on tour. It was completely over the top. And then Powell says, and by the way, this is likely to be a really nasty meeting. It may well break up. We don't know what's going to happen. They may walk out. But we're all going to ride together in the bus to Crawford. But guess what, Bob? I'm not going back with you. I'm staying with the president to do a press conference. And so whatever happens, you're on your own when you go back to the South. And so I gulped and saluted and said, okay. So the Crown Prince arrives with great ceremony. He comes down the ramp of his 747, and they had a group of former Aramco secretaries who had retired in Texas, mostly in the Houston area, and they had bussed them up to greet Crown Prince Abdullah. And they greeted him with bouquets of flowers and hugs and kisses. And it reminds you a little bit of a nicer day in Saudi Arabia, when Americans really were liked and when Americans really liked being there. And these women, as aged as they were, had genuine affection for Saudi Arabia, genuine affection for the Crown Prince. And so you could see this warming him up a little bit. So we get in the bus, and it's the Crown Prince, Powell, me, Prince Bandar, the Saudi ambassador to the U.S., Don Ensenat, who was the chief of protocol, and Prince Saud, the foreign minister. And we start driving through the Texas countryside, and as you know, in April, the Texas countryside is really beautiful. And so we're going through these pastoral areas on the drive to Crawford, and we look at the Crown Prince, by the way, is fascinated, and he is sitting shotgun up in the front seat next to the driver, chain smoking the whole time. And the windows, of course, are closed, so we're suffocating. But he's fascinated, as is Prince Saud, the foreign minister. And he turns to Powell. He and Powell are kind of buddies. And he turns to Powell and says, "What are those flowers out there on the hillside?" Powell says, "Oh, I think that's alfalfa." And I said, "No, those are bluebonnets, Your Royal Highness." So without batting an eye, Saud turns to Powell and says, "You grew up in New York. What do you know about alfalfa?" And the tension was still so palpable you could cut it with a knife. There had been an article in the New York Times that very day saying that if we didn't make progress at the summit, the Saudis were going to start using oil as a weapon. Prince Bandar was widely referred to as the source. He vociferously denied it, but my guess is he probably was the source for that. At any rate, we go to the summit, we go to the ranch. There are various sub-meetings that are going on, and so the president and the Crown Prince go off with a couple of, with Condi Rice, who is there, who already was at the ranch, and Powell. And we take a break, and the interpreter, Gamal Halal, who was a terrific guy, came out and he said, "This is not going well. They're talking in Arabic about walking out. What are we going to do?" And so President Bush, this just shows you his genius in a way, turns to the Crown Prince, calls him out with the interpreter and says, "How'd you like to go for a ride in my pickup truck?" And so they jump into his Ford F-250 pickup with the interpreter in the back, and off they go with the Secret Service chasing them in their pickups behind. And they go for a tour of the ranch. And I've gone on this tour with the president, and he loves this ranch, and he gets so enthusiastic about it, and he'll tell you he's got 17 varieties of trees and about 8 waterfalls and stock tanks, and he just gets so emotionally excited about it. And sure enough, after 45 minutes, they came back, and they were beaming. Literally, they were now new best friends. They got out, they still had difficult issues to address, but they had bonded on a personal level that I think is so important in diplomacy, particularly with heads of state, and frankly has been so lacking in the last 6 or 8 years. So this is something that I was very happy to see, and I think kind of reset the tone, at least, for what we had to do next. And what we had to do next was to address these 8 demands from the Saudis, and it turns out the president didn't even know about them. And I asked Bandar what happened, and he said, well, he had delivered the demands to the White House and had been told that they were going to be taken care of by the Vice President's office. And so, again, I don't have any inside information here, but apparently the Vice President's office decided to either handle or ignore the 8 demands. The President was not happy. And we started working through the demands, and Of course, a couple of them were demands of the Israelis to release Arafat from his confinement in Ramallah, to end the siege of the Church of the Nativity, and then some further guarantees on efforts to bring peace talks back together between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Condi Rice called Danny Ayalon in the middle of the night. He was the foreign policy advisor to Ariel Sharon. And woke him up, I think, got him to promise that he would make sure they ended the siege and they ended the confinement of Arafat. And so we were able to have what's called deliverables. And in a summit meeting, you basically work on what are called deliverables. Typically, you would have already worked these out ahead of time, but for reasons that I still don't understand, the major ones had not been addressed before this summit meeting. But luckily, enough got done that the Crown Prince and the delegation didn't walk out. We breathed a collective sigh of relief and headed back to the bus. And I knew at this point that the bus ride would not be as horrible as I was expecting it to be when we set out. In fact, Prince Saud and Prince Bandar were deliriously happy when they got on the bus, and I sat back with them while the Crown Prince continued to ride shotgun on our way back to Waco. And they got so deliriously happy, they started singing Broadway show tunes. Mostly from My Fair Lady.
Oh my God!
The Rain in Spain falls mainly in the plain. And then my favorite one, Why Can't a Woman Be Like a Man? And I don't know what that says about Saudi Arabia. But it was really memorable. And so that gave me an appreciation, I think, for the importance of advanced planning in presidential summits. We did another summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, in the summer of 2003. And this was a separate summit with the Arabs, and then they did a joint summit with the Israelis in Aqaba after that. It was a less contentious time, but because, of course, the Israelis were not present at the part that we did. But again, you could see how the president had developed his personal relationship with Abdullah in a really significant way. I'll have to tell you another story about that summit, though. On the cover of my book, and you saw the cover on the video, it shows me walking down a hallway with Prince Al-Walid bin Talal. He, at that time, was about the fourth richest man in the world. We were just opening the Saks Fifth Avenue in Riyadh, which is what the picture is all about. But he owned and has owned large shares of Disney and Citicorp. He's actually very pro-American and very liberal. And he called me up one day before this Sharm el-Sheikh summit, and he said, I want to meet with the president when he's in Sharm el-Sheikh, because the summit was at his hotel, the Four Seasons, in Sharm el-Sheikh. He was our host in a way. Well, I called the White House, and they said, can't be done. Sorry, the president is double, triple booked. We can't do it. I pushed back a little bit, and finally they said, all right, they can have a pull-aside handshake after the breakfast with Mubarak at 7:30 in the morning. And so I called Al-Walid back, and he said, that's fine. So sure enough, after the breakfast, which of course ran late, Al-Walid comes up for his pull-aside handshake with President Bush. And the president is with the Crown Prince, and they are to ride back together in a golf cart to the suite where we were going to then have our bilateral meeting separately. Well, Al-Walid just won't quit talking. And he continues to talk to the president. The president's very nice to him, but he finally jumps in the golf cart with Abdullah and sort of guns it, and off he goes. Well, this doesn't deter Al-Walid either, and he keeps dog trotting alongside the golf cart. And I'm sitting back several blocks down the sidewalk with Prince Bandar and Prince Saud waiting for them to arrive. And we see on the horizon this golf cart getting larger and larger, with this white flowing robe next to it billowing out on the side as he's trying to keep up, panting and keeping up with the golf cart. And I never have seen Saud and Bandar laugh harder in my life. I think they have a bit of a rivalry with Al-Walid, and so this was some inter-family stuff going on, I suspect, as well. But it was charming and funny in a way. So then, Al-Walid about 2 weeks later sends me a video, back when we still had VHS tapes, a video of the meeting. And he has edited the meeting to make it look like President Bush came to Sharm el-Sheikh to see him. Very clever editing, and you have to give him credit. He's clearly the Donald Trump of Saudi Arabia. But that brings me now to the summit that we've just seen. And I would call this, in a way, a mini summit, maybe actually more comparable to the summit that the first one we had in April of 2002, because this was two leaders getting to know each other. As you may recall, King Salman boycotted the Gulf Leaders Presidential Summit at Camp David. And this was a subject of a lot of commentary. But now, interestingly, King Salman got his own moment in the sun without having to share it with other Gulf leaders. And I think they were able to focus more directly on the U.S.-Saudi relationship in a way that might not have been possible if it was subsumed within the meeting of the other Gulf leaders. And we don't have all details, but I think we have seen a greater commitment now by the U.S. to the security of the Gulf states, in addition to Israel, of course, as a consequence of this meeting. The Saudis have made no secret of their unhappiness with the way this administration has operated in the Middle East for the last 6 or 7 years. They were very critical of the idea of throwing Hosni Mubarak over the side in Egypt. They were very critical of the embrace of the Muslim Brotherhood, who certainly the Emiratis and the Saudis consider to be a terrorist organization. And they were very critical of the failure to enforce the Red Line Declaration against Bashar al-Assad's use of chemical weapons in Syria. And so the level of trust had dropped dramatically. I think this summit was an effort to reset that, to renew trust, and to get fairly specific about it. And so they announced the intention, at least, to go forward with a $1 billion arms sale. And it's by way of footnote, about a year and a half ago, a $60 billion arms sale had already been announced. And so it's not clear if this current one is part of that long-term plan or not. My guess is it takes it a step further. My guess is that they are now being offered theater ballistic missile defense systems, the THAAD system, which is quite sophisticated, to supplement their Patriot missiles. They're likely being offered security guarantees, which frankly are not of the level of a treaty, and therefore are kind of in the eye of the beholder. And I think this is where there may be some potential for misunderstanding, or at least non-performance down the line. But a strong effort is being made to convince the Saudis and the other Gulf states that we have their back, that there will be no way Iran will be allowed to have a nuclear weapon, and there will also be no way they will be allowed to use this $150 billion windfall from the release of the frozen funds of theirs to destabilize the Middle East further than they already are doing. A lot, of course, depends on action, because we've seen bold words and a lot of chest pounding in the past. And so I think you have to maintain a certain degree of skepticism about where this is going to go. But it's probably the best we can expect from the region and from the relationship right now. We can talk a little further down the line on how this relationship should be structured and what it ought to look like in the future. But I do think that we have at least made some progress. I think a lot remains to be seen on how the Saudis will perform in Yemen. I'm sure that was a topic of discussion. The U.S. has provided some assistance in the bombing campaign, the air campaign in Yemen, but there have been enormous civilian casualties, an enormous humanitarian crisis that has not been properly addressed, frankly, either by the Saudis or by the United States. And I think this is probably something that is going to need to be developed even further. There likely was discussion about extremism, extremist ideology, tamping down the horrendous content of many of the textbooks that are being sent by the Saudis around the world to the madrasas and other educational institutions. And I suspect that was not particularly welcome by King Salman, but I certainly know that his new foreign minister, Adel al-Jubeir, understands the importance of tamping down this extremism, having just recently served as the Saudi ambassador to the U.S. So with that, let me invite Diana up, and we'll talk some more.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a seat. These are working quite well. Thank you so much for both the color and the insight that you gave us into the first summit in particular, as well as the second summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, and your experience there. It was really, really interesting. And I appreciate you commenting on the King's visit this week, which I think is so timely and so relevant. And I guess I would like to ask you a couple of questions, take my prerogative as the moderator to ask at least one question, which in addition to bluebonnets in Texas, we have shale. And as the U.S. gets less dependent on Mideast oil, how does that shift the relationship? What would you say?
A lot of people have said that this allows us to split the sheets with the Saudis, but nothing could be further from the truth. We have a vital U.S. interest in the Middle East, regardless of how independent we are from an energy standpoint. And let's bear in mind that even at the moment, we do not have complete independence from the Saudis. A significant portion of our refineries cannot refine U.S.-made crude and refine or calibrated refine only Saudi crude. And so we're still importing a fair amount from the Saudis. But the worldwide price of oil is something that we continue to have a significant interest in. If, for example, the Strait of Hormuz is closed, 40% of the world's oil supply goes through that strait. If the Yemenis are taken over by Iranian sympathizers, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait on the Red Sea could be closed to oil traffic as well. If oil shoots in Europe to $200 a barrel, who's going to buy our computers, our cars, our consulting services? America's economy is at risk from losing its ability to make sales and to conduct global commerce. And so this is not something that we can simply stick our head in the sand about. We also have other vital national interests, particularly with the Saudis. We do, despite all the ideological extremism that we continue to see, we still have a common interest in fighting terrorism, in fighting ISIS, in fighting Al-Qaeda. And the Saudis have not been perfect by any means, but they have been much better than they used to be. And there are only allies in the Middle East capable of making a real dent in this. We still have great concerns about Iranian expansionism and destabilization of this part of the world. We can't stick our head in the sand about that either. And I think we have a military interest in maintaining freedom of the seas, maintaining freedom of commerce. And so we have a very large naval base in Bahrain, which requires Saudi support to influence the Bahrainis. We have military operations in the UAE, in Qatar, and many other parts of the Middle East. You can't project power in many parts of the world without overflying large countries in the Middle East, particularly Saudi Arabia. To do that, you need their permission. To do that, you have to have a relationship. And so diplomacy, including military-to-military relationships, I think will remain very important for a long time to come.
Thank you. I also noticed in the book that you write so affectionately, actually, about King Abdullah and the work that he was doing inside the kingdom and the slow but consistent effort he made in terms of reforming the kingdom and trying to enhance women's rights and human rights. And I'm wondering what you make of King Salman and what you think we have to expect from him in terms of those issues.
For some odd reason, Parade magazine every year listed King Abdullah as one of the 5 worst dictators in the world. But the truth, I think, is much more nuanced. He was a reformer. He wasn't a perfect reformer, but he has had to deal with a society that in many ways would rather live in the 7th century than the 21st. he and like-minded Saudi royals have been trying to drag their society, kicking and screaming, into modern times. One of the things I say in the book about my efforts there was to get the Saudis qualified to join the World Trade Organization, the WTO. And to do that, they had to completely reform their economy, pass new laws, open themselves up to foreign direct investment. And it is having the effect over time of modernizing their society, opening jobs for women, creating a more market-based economy. The difficulty that Abdullah had was that not even all members of the royal family shared his view of reform. But he instituted enormous opportunities for women. We now have, I think, 55% of the college graduates in Saudi Arabia are women. He instituted a scholarship program, so now there are about 80,000 Saudi students studying in the United States, and probably another 100,000 studying in other parts of the Western world. They come over here with their extended families. All of this is paid for by the Saudi government, and then they go back and they've at least had some exposure to critical thinking, to American educational systems, and in many ways American values. It doesn't mean that they embrace all of that, but it's sure a lot better than having them go to some Sharia school or Islamic school where all they learn is the Quran. This, over time, again, I think, will have a very significant favorable impact. But Salman, on the other hand, as I told you the story about being in denial over the 15 hijackers, but at the same time, he is known as a relatively non-corrupt senior royal. He has 3 sons who I know fairly well and respect. One of them, Sultan, was a Saudi astronaut in 1985. One of his brothers, Faisal, was a college professor who then later took over the family publishing empire, and they had a very large empire with, including a number of well-respected Arabic newspapers. And then Abdulaziz bin Salman is the Deputy Minister of Petroleum. If Ali Naimi ever retires, and some people wonder whether he ever will, Abdulaziz may well become the next Minister of Petroleum. He's a very well-educated, smart guy. One of the sons that I don't know is Mohammed bin Salman. Mohammed bin Salman is the Deputy Crown Prince, the Minister of Defense at the ripe old age of 29. So he would have been 18 or 19 when I was in office. And I suspect he probably was in the room a few times, but I don't really have any relationship with him. I will simply say, though, that the adventurism in Yemen is on him. He will probably make or break his reputation based on how this ends. And I don't see the end in sight at the moment. And we have yet to hear from the Saudis a political objective for the fight. It appears to me that their objective is to completely decimate the Houthis and to declare victory rather than engaging in any kind of pluralistic power-sharing agreement in Yemen. So I think the jury is out on Salman. He has also replaced a couple of Abdullah's more liberal appointments in the Ministry of Education and in the Ministry of Islamic Affairs with more conservative figures that Abdullah had previously ousted. So some of this, I think, is the give and take of politics. And anyone who doesn't think the royal family engages in domestic politics is missing the point here. This king is not all-powerful. They operate by consensus. There are probably 30 senior royals who form kind of a kitchen cabinet in a way, and whose indulgence and consent is necessary for the king to govern. Let's not forget that they have had some power shifts in the past because of a palace coup or other decisions by senior members of the royal family that a particular king, King Saud comes to mind, was not up to it. Saud left office at the urging of his brothers. King Faisal came in. King Faisal was then assassinated by a nephew partly for trying to institute more reforms in Saudi Arabia. So I'm not saying this is likely to happen anytime soon, but I think Salman has to show that he's capable of governing, that he can manage the budget, which is a serious issue for them right now, and that he isn't so power hungry that he is giving so many major appointments to his own sons.
Great answer. Let me open it up to the floor. Sandy?
I'd like to follow up Diana's questions. Your first question was
Can you
one I
take
was
a
going
mic?
to ask anyway.
Thank you.
But I want to probe more into the question of the importance of cultural exchange, which Diana raised in her second question, and you answered it in part. But I'd like to know if there is awareness among the Saudi family of how cultural exchange worked in the relationship between the U.S. and the USSR. When I was director of Penn State University Press, we published a book by Foreign Service officer Yale Richmond called Cultural Exchange and the End of the Cold War, in which he documented the many, many ways in which cultural exchange took place between people in the United States and people in the Soviet Union, and how even the leaders, the advisors closest to Gorbachev were influenced strongly by this. So if that had an effect in the whole opening up of the Soviet Union, are the Saudi Arabian royal family aware that they possibly could undermine their own authoritarian governmental structure by allowing this cultural exchange to go too far?
That's a fascinating question, and the answer isn't terribly obvious right now. They have engaged in a number of cultural exchanges, and obviously the scholarship program is probably of the grandest scale and the grandest kind of, at least, cultural exposure to America. During the time I was ambassador, bearing in mind that it was right after 9/11, we tried to get a number of Saudi delegations to come to the U.S., and then of course we had quite a number of U.S. delegations coming to Saudi Arabia, more from a congressional standpoint than a cultural exchange standpoint at that time. The Saudis were very reluctant to expose themselves to the U.S. right after 9/11. Ironically, before 9/11, many Saudis came to the U.S., had second homes or third homes here, vacationed at Disneyland. Saudia Airlines had a non-stop flight to Orlando. They also had a non-stop flight to Rochester, Minnesota, to the Mayo Clinic. So many Saudis considered themselves almost adjunct American citizens. Many Saudis, probably 30+ thousand Saudis were in college in the U.S. at the time of 9/11. That dropped to about 5,000 after 9/11, partly because our visa standards were made so rigid that the Saudis couldn't qualify to come back to school here, and likewise for medical tourism. So there are efforts underway. It's hard for me to pinpoint a sense that they believe that's a threat to the regime, that American exchanges would inculcate so many democratic values, for example, that they would go forward. Most of the people who are opposed to the Saudi regime are not really pro-democracy. They are anti-regime and pro-Islamist extremism. And so the ones who are really trying to take down the royal family are Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and their colleagues.
Jack, and then this woman.
Bob, did I hear or read correctly that King Salman more or less endorsed the Iran agreement when he was in Washington recently? And is that agreement now, in your view, a fait accompli?
I think, Jack, that's a good way to put it. He more or less endorsed it, with maybe an emphasis on the less. The Saudis have been very upset about the agreement. They don't think it's tight enough, and they think it allows Iran to run rampant in the region with an extra $150 billion. What the Saudis have said is, and they've been very polite about this, they initially said they support any agreement that effectively curtails arms proliferation in the Middle East. Hint, Israel is probably included in that discussion. More recently, Friday, they did say that based on the assurances from President Obama they support the agreement as it has been described to them. So I think there's still some play in the joints. I think they are going to insist on rigid inspections. They're going to insist on the most careful monitoring possible. But they also realize it is a fait accompli. They know they can't derail it, and so I think they don't want to spend their political capital huffing and puffing over something they can't do much about. What they want to do instead is see what they can get out of that. And what they can get out of it is the enhanced defense armaments that we were talking about a minute ago, that I think we'll see more about in the press. Along with, I think, probably a more express commitment to their security from the United States.
My question has to do with America's relationship with the Arab world. It seems like there's a sharp line between the Sunni powers and the Shia powers. Our old friends, pre-9/11, were primarily the Sunni powers. They were pretty much the ones who ran things anyway. Today there are Shia powers, and there would be some sense that we are trying to find a way to have a relationship on the other side of that bright divide. Can you give some guidance as to whether we can do both and, or do we have to choose?
Well, right now it's hard to imagine a close relationship with Iran under its current leadership. We did have a close relationship with Iran until the revolution in 1979, but it wasn't based so much on a Shia relationship as it was the balance of power in the Middle East. We had a relatively even balance of power at that time between Sunni and Shia, between Persian and Arab. We had a robust Egypt, we had a robust Saudi Arabia, and in many ways we had a robust Iran, and even Iraq under Saddam was a counterbalance to Iran. Of course, they fought a large war over that. Since the revolution, it has been very difficult to find an opening to that part of the world, and the Sunnis have interpreted the revolution as being directed largely at them and largely at supporting the Shiite minorities in their midst. And there has been more than a grain of truth to that. And so Iran has exported its revolution to many parts of the Sunni Middle East. The Saudis' biggest concern, I think, it isn't a nuclear Iran. It is an Iran that has a better relationship with the U.S. and in some ways diminishes the U.S.-Saudi role over the next several generations. That is still a long way off, I suspect. But it comes as no surprise that we would prefer to have a decent relationship with an Iran that can live at peace with its neighbors. But as long as they're supporting Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and the insurgencies and other destabilization efforts against these monarchs, it's very difficult. At the same time, in many ways, the Sunni monarchs, and especially the Saudis, have become more zealous in their Sunniism, more zealous in their anti-Shia approach. Even as recently as when I was in office in Riyadh 14 years ago, the Saudi narrative at that time was that everything was the fault of the Israelis. You don't hear that anymore. It's now all the fault of the Iranians. And their national narrative has changed a great deal. And I think it has led to a more zealous embrace of Sunni fundamentalism.
Can you go to the gentleman in the back? He's got his hand up, and then Lynn.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much. My name is Thomas Cavana. I am the new postdoc at the Tower Center. I wanted to react to something that you said. You made a comment on the fact that personal diplomacy is very important, that it's very important to build, to forge personal relationships with other leaders of the world. And you also made the comment that this had been somewhat lost in the last 6 to 8 years. So I wanted to know if you could tell us a little more about maybe examples of that being lost and the consequences. Thank you very much.
Well, I don't want this to become political. I think it has more to do with governing style than it does political ideology. But I think it's been no secret that President Obama has not been particularly interested in forging personal relationships with other heads of state around the world, particularly in the Muslim world. He made a speech in Cairo in which he embraced and made outreach to the Muslim world, but didn't really follow through very much on that. He has also had a very difficult time with Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, and this has become personal. And so there have been examples, I think, where this has been a real problem. Now, let me also say that there have been many instances in past history where presidents also have not developed many personal relationships. President Eisenhower was not known as a particularly garrulous individual who went around making friends around the world. He was friends with some of the World War II leaders, but he was not someone who reached out a great deal. And you can have other examples. And you can also have examples where an effort to develop a personal relationship can backfire. We all famously remember President Bush 43 saying he looked into Putin's soul. And that didn't turn out so well. So I do think there are examples on both sides of the coin among all parties. But the personal relationship that you can develop becomes very important. I think the Bush 43-Tony Blair relationship is a good example of how you can forge something together and try to support each other, partly out of friendship and partly out of a sense of loyalty, in addition to looking out for your own country's best interests.
Thank you, Bob. Thanks for your talk, and I wanted to explore a bit further the conflicts in the Middle East right now are not just Sunni and Shia, but they are balance of power, which seem to be playing out in Yemen. And the Saudis are very involved in bombing Yemen, but I read an article recently about the Emiratis who have sent in their military to stabilize things there and to offer help where they can. And in fact, I read that a lot of the Yemenis now consider the Emiratis to be their saving force over anybody in the Yemeni government or in the Saudi government. And I wanted to also ask how that plays out with Iran supporting the Houthis.
Lynn, thank you. The Emiratis, I think, are very capable strategists in the Middle East. They have come in not only with air power, but also with some ground forces. This is an area where the Saudis have not been able to be very successful. They don't have much of a ground force presence, and the presence they have is more oriented toward kinetic military efforts than it is toward either nation building or pacifying the population. We've also seen, just announced in the last day or so, Qatar is sending about 1,000 ground troops to Yemen, and so they have joined the effort, I think, in a significant way. The Saudis have relied on air power, and it's not unlike, I think, some of the exercise of American air power in other conflicts. That's probably the civilian casualties that are incurred in bombing efforts can dramatically alienate the local population. And so you're seen as indiscriminately attacking innocent women and children. Part of that, of course, is the phenomenon of these insurgents embedding themselves in civilian buildings, targets, residences, and so forth. But it completely infuriates the local population. The local population in Yemen was very angry at U.S. drone strikes in Yemen. And so I think we've also seen that phenomenon as well. And so it's not surprising that if you come in with ground forces who can actually pacify and make a person-to-person connection with the local population. This is, in many ways, the David Petraeus counterinsurgency doctrine. And you can be successful at that.
Go ahead, this gentleman.
Bob, what's the relationship, do you believe, now between the royals and perhaps what I'll just call the militaristic Sunnis, the ISIS, the Al-Qaedas, the other groups. Is there still a problem of the royals having to play both sides of the coin to stay in power? And are there any threats by some of those groups today?
Yeah, Rick, there are vast threats by ISIS and Al-Qaeda against the royal family. Bear in mind that when King Fahd refused to allow Osama bin Laden to expel Saddam Hussein from Kuwait and instead turned to 500,000 U.S. military troops, that was where Osama bin Laden really split the sheets with the Saudi royal family. He lost his citizenship in 1994. And so Al-Qaeda has been a sworn enemy of this royal family for 20 years. ISIS has followed suit. And their vision is to take over Mecca and Medina and to have a caliphate that extends all the way north through Damascus and up to Istanbul. So there is a tremendous enmity between these groups, these organizations. Al-Qaeda tried to kill the current crown prince, Mohammed bin Nayef. He had arranged to meet with a guy who was going to turn himself in his office. The guy shows up and in a body cavity has a bomb, blows himself up, and almost kills Mohammed bin Nayef. So there are daily plots against the royal family by these organizations. On the other hand, there also clearly are those within Saudi Arabia, extremists, who are funding a lot of what's going on. But there is zero evidence that any senior royal member or any senior government official has, to this day, played a role in that.
This gentleman has had his hand up for a long time, and then I'm going to go to a student in the back. So.
What do you think the eventual outcome in Syria is going to be, and what's our part in the game?
If you can solve that in 5 minutes or less, we'll send you back to Washington.
But the honest answer is I wish I knew. My guess is we're going to see a Balkanized Syria where some vestige of the Alawites will be in Damascus. Aleppo, it could go either way. Much of the rest of the country is going to be in play with ISIS for quite some time, I fear. I don't think they'll be taken out, and so they're going to govern a fair amount of Syria. You know, ISIS, between what they control in Syria and Iraq, governs about 10 million people. Actually governs. They collect taxes, they have banks, they buy and sell oil. It's really shocking. And so I think we're going to see a long period before they can be sufficiently degraded. But I think Bashar al-Assad will probably have some sort of transition period. The Russians are rumored to be increasing their air and ground forces, either to support Assad or to help create an atmosphere of stability during a transition. We don't know really which way that's going to go yet.
Would you say the Saudis and the United States share the same view of preferred outcome, or do we differ?
I think the Saudis would rather get rid of Bashar first and then deal with ISIS, and I think the Americans would rather have it the other way.
Hello. When oil prices plummeted in late 2014, there were a lot of theories about why the Saudis didn't attempt to stop the plummet by cutting supply and by limiting production. One of the more interesting theories that I've heard recently is that they actually see oil ending as a useful commodity within the long-term future and are actually attempting to divest in the long term, which is backed up. I believe the energy minister of Saudi Arabia actually said that it's possible that Saudi Arabia would be exporting solar energy by 2050, not oil. Do you think there's any credence to the idea that Saudi Arabia sees peak demand occurring soon, if not already having occurred, and that in the long term they may be trying to get away from oil as a long-term strategy?
I think that's an intriguing theory, but I don't think it holds up under analysis. I think the Saudis initially, and even to a great degree today, simply wanted to maintain market share. If I'm McDonald's and I decide I want to raise the price of hamburgers, and so I cut my production of hamburgers, what's going to happen? They're going to go to Burger King. And I think the Saudis see their market as going to other competitors, particularly the Russians who are happy to produce, and by the way, the Americans who have increased production dramatically over the last 5 years. 9 million barrels a day have been added to supply over the last 5 years. 4 million of that has been from U.S. shale producers. And so I think that the Saudis wanted to maintain market share. I think they also, by the way, were afraid that if they cut production, 1.5 million barrels a day, nothing would happen. They wouldn't raise the price of oil because someone else would come in and fill that void. And by the way, there was about a 2 million barrel a day surplus. So the idea of a Saudi move, even up to 2 million barrels a day, having any significant impact on price, I think may be out of date. And they can't control OPEC anymore. And so even if OPEC sets a lower production quota, there will be so much cheating going on, to say nothing of the non-OPEC producers in the world, including the U.S., that I think it will be very difficult. I sincerely doubt that King Salman, when he met with President Obama on Friday, said, okay, if you'll cut 2 million barrels a day, we'll cut 2 million barrels a day. That conversation didn't occur. The further Saudi policy, I think, has had the incidental benefit of harming Iran, their mortal enemy, of harming Russia, who has been no friend of the Saudis lately, and of harming the high-cost U.S. shale producers. But where they miscalculated was in underestimating the ingenuity of American shale producers, the ability to cut costs, and the ability to live with $40 oil. And so it didn't have the effect they wanted, I think, except for the ones who had borrowed at higher interest rates and had higher cost of production and were smart enough to figure out how to reduce their costs.
Student in the back.
My name is Zach Miller. I'm a first-year student here, and my question relates to domestic issues within Saudi Arabia. I was just curious as to how you mentioned earlier that as Salman took power, he kind of replaced some of Abdullah's more liberal appointees with more conservative ones, and I was kind of curious as to how the religious police in Saudi Arabia kind of tied into that and how their influence might have been diminished when Abdullah was in power, and whether or not in the future it will kind of come back with King Salman.
And can I add on to that and just ask you to consider what that might do to the rise of Wahhabi extremists within the kingdom and their influence?
Yeah, excellent question. And one of the individuals that Salman did replace was the head of the religious police, who had been appointed by Abdullah as a more liberal, enlightened kind of guy. And instead, he was sent packing by Salman. And I believe the same guy who had previously headed it is now back in power in running the religious police. The element that softens that a little bit is that they, even under the previous head, had developed a better training program with more constraints on their behavior. And I think we are hearing of many fewer extreme incidents of misbehavior of the religious police today than we did 15 years ago. But it does have a connection to the expansion of Wahhabist or Salafist extremism, I think, to the extent that they are generally supported by the population. And I think until they get a handle on religious education and the content of the sermons in the mosques on Friday, and the vetting of, education of, and approval of the imams in the mosques, not much is going to happen.
I think we have time for, we'll have time for 2 more questions. We have someone in the back and maybe one last question.
Hi, my name is Khatra Alizada. I would like to ask a question regarding the Arab world strategies in Yemen and in Syria. We hear a lot that in Yemen, the Arab world is making a coalition to deal with Yemen. However, we don't hear that much in regards to Syria. Is it because they have the Arab world, different countries, they have different interests, or what is the different strategies followed in each of these two cases?
Thank you. Excellent question. The coalition that has come together of the Gulf countries in Yemen has a more defined objective, I think. They have said, by the way, just in the last couple of days, that after they finish off the Houthis, they're then going to turn their attention to Syria. And Syria is a larger challenge. It has many more moving parts, I think, but you've got not only Bashar, but then you've got ISIS, you've got Nusra, you've got Al-Qaeda, and you're trying to find a local group that you can align with to counter what's going on. In Yemen, you actually have a legitimized government, at least a so-called legitimate government, that has been in exile in Saudi Arabia. And you have the ability to take and hold territory. So they have retaken Aden, for example, although not the surrounding areas. They now say they're going to march on Sana'a and take Sana'a. And if they do that, then they will have essentially been in spring training for the next effort, which would be Syria, I think. It takes so much more in the way of assets and boots on the ground to deal with a country as vast as Syria. And this is a coalition, by the way, that it's been talked about for a long time. I can recall 3 years ago, Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel convening a meeting of the Gulf Cooperation Council and saying, you guys need a joint military command. They still don't have it. They still don't have interoperability. Some of them fly F-16, some fly F-15s. Some have British, some have French military hardware. And their software also is quite different and not compatible. To say nothing of some of the rivalries between even the Sunni Gulf countries. So it's a Herculean task to cobble together a coalition like this to fight an ill-defined enemy without particular borders. And I think it's understandable that they can try to do this in Yemen. And by the way, that's no cakewalk either. But I think it is a somewhat simpler task by comparison to Syria.
Jean, why don't you ask the last question?
One last thing. I know it's late, but so you have more women than ever graduating and going to school in Saudi Arabia and then going outside the country to study. Are the women going to come back and change the culture in Saudi? Isn't it about time?
I certainly was saying that 14 years ago and felt that at that time it was about time, past time. It depends on which women you talk with in Saudi Arabia. Most of the women I talked with 14 years ago didn't care so much about driving. They wanted jobs. They could hire a driver, but they wanted a chance at economic opportunity in Saudi Arabia. And the driving thing was more a media idea in their mind at that point. I think it's changed somewhat now. I think driving now is seen as more a symbol of oppression, a symbol of independence, a symbol of flexibility. And so I think it's probably more important to the Saudi women today than it was before. But job opportunities are still important. We are seeing some progress. For example, women can now be lawyers in Saudi Arabia. They can appear in court. Some of the judges didn't get that memo because when women would show up, the judge would say, where's your husband or your father to give you permission to be here in court? Crown Prince Abdullah, or King Abdullah, changed that overnight and fired some people and said, no, this is not what I intended. We're going to do it the right way. So I think the women coming back will have an opportunity to make change. But again, they have been raised in a family system with values that they frankly don't want Western interference on. They want to do it their way, the Muslim way. And so there's going to be a certain amount of cherry picking of their Western experience filtered through their eyes and their cultural disposition. And we've had quite a number of Saudi women say, thanks for your interest, but let us do this our way. And we may want to cover. We may want to completely wear the abaya because it protects our modesty. We may well want our husbands to put us on a pedestal and treat us like some treasure. There is a very complex sort of national psychology about the role of women. And I don't think you can count on necessarily the women to lead the charge in all instances. They're going to be selective, I think, about what issues from the West they want to incorporate, which they respect, and which they consider to be depraved and beneath them.
And what about his question?
I did, but that's fine.
Okay. Sorry. Thank you for standing up for my colleague Hiroki. I was right in front of me and I didn't even see him. I would also be remiss in closing before I mention the Council on Foreign Relations, which also helped co-sponsor this event today. And I'd like to have you join me in thanking Ambassador Jordan. And after, we can go out for book signings if you're interested. Okay? Thank you so much.